Hello, and welcome to The Conspiracy Show. I'm Richard Syrett. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., leader of the African American Civil Rights Movement and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. He was just 39. 2 months later, James Earl Ray, a fugitive from the Missouri State Penitentiary, was arrested at London's Heathrow Airport, extradited to the United States, and charged with the murder of Dr. King. On the advice of his lawyer, Ray entered a plea of guilty and was sentenced to 99 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. In later years, Ray tried unsuccessfully to withdraw his guilty plea. He died in prison in April 1998. On this episode of The Conspiracy Show, we investigate the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We'll also explore the claim that James Earl Ray was framed for Dr. King's murder. We'll also examine the possibility that King's assassination was a conspiracy orchestrated inside several local, state, and federal government agencies. I'll speak with two assassination researchers and a former member of the U.S. Congress who affirm James Earl Ray was a mere patsy and that King was a victim of a vast conspiracy involving the FBI, the CIA, the Pentagon, and possibly his political enemies inside the U.S. White House. And we'll meet a skeptic who insists Dr. King was murdered by an avowed racist and petty criminal named James Earl Ray, a two-time loser looking to make a name for himself. Me? I just want the truth, and I'm willing to follow it wherever it leads. It is time to redefine reality. Genetic enigma or a human alien hybrid? That's how cynical I am now about the process. Mainstream media, technology, and alter weather patterns created by the corporation has been engineered by the Illuminati.
There's no doubt.
James Earl Ray was just an average criminal. He never did commit anything serious, but his entire family were just a bunch of petty criminals. They were not part of the mafia. They just happened to be handy and sucked into the process. Again, it was an FBI, CIA operation. James had been contacted by an undercover FBI agent that went on the code name Raoul. Raoul had contacted James and told him he had a gun deal going down in Memphis and wanted James to come help him with it. So Raoul said, now, what we need to do is I want you to go to a local gun shop and buy a high-powered rifle with a scope on it and come back here and we'll go to the next phase. And so James went to the gun shop and bought a .243 caliber rifle with a scope on it. Came back and Raoul looked at it and he says, you idiot, that's wrong caliber. We need a .30-06. And the reason they needed a .30-06 was because the actual gun that killed King was a .30-06.
He was kind of courier for this contact guy, Raoul. And Raoul has all the earmarks of being a CIA drug runner and a CIA gun runner. And those are the kind of things that Ray was doing for him. And he books a room at Raoul's direction at this place called Bessie's Boarding House, which is across the street and right above a place called Jim's Grill. He went into this very low class, I don't even want to call it a motel. It was more like a flop house, really, a boarding house, with a sport coat, a white shirt, and a tie. Now, obviously, he's got to be the only guy in there dressed like that, so this is going to make a very vivid impression.
So I was able to interview James Earl Ray in the hospital there in the Nashville prison for an hour and asked him to give me the details. And he told me about the deal with Raoul. He said Raoul asked him to get this rifle, and he said I was up in the room and I heard a shot, and then I decided I better get out of there. So he went to his car and drove away. On the radio, they were talking about James Earl Ray escaping, and of course they already had his name. They had their patsy was already identified.
You also have to buy into that Ray shot King from a communal bathroom. You had to wait outside a door, to get into the bathroom. You're supposed to believe that he actually was going to gamble on getting into this bathroom at the very same time that King comes out of the balcony, or that he's inside the bath with somebody waiting right outside to see him with a rifle.
His attorney told him that if he would plead guilty and end the trial, that within 2 weeks he would demand a retrial, and he had enough evidence to get him completely off.
If we believe the official story says that somehow Ray ran out of the bathroom, collected his stuff in his room in a little briefcase or a small suitcase, ran down the stairs, and then right before he's supposed to jump into his car, he dropped the briefcase right on the street there in front of a place called Kniep's Novelty Store. If Ray actually did that, he should be deemed guilty by reason of insanity. So in other words, a guy who's just planned an assassination, who's now escaping from the scene of the crime, then goes ahead and leaves everything right on the street for the police to pick up, and this begins a manhunt for Ray. Now, the problem with this story is that Ray's first lawyer, Mr. Haynes, interviewed the guy who owned Kniep's Novelty Store. Mr. Kniep said, no, that was dropped about 10 minutes before the assassination. And this, of course, would have blown up the whole case if it would have gone to trial and if that evidence would have been presented.
Right, this is a typical claim. Who is this owner? What's his name? When was he interviewed? When does he say this happened? What time does he say it happened? How good is his recollection of these sorts of things? As we know from studies on eyewitness reliability, they're not reliable at all. They confabulate. Maybe did this come out a day later, a year later, a decade later? These sorts of things are just tossed out there on the internet to fuel conspiracy theories, but the government has fingerprints of James Earl Ray on that material. It's his. So unless you think that he was a patsy, somebody took his hand, touched it on things while he was asleep or something, and then went and planted it, that's even more absurd than any other conspiracy involving this.
Another problem is once he does get away, once Ray does get away from Memphis, he goes on this really long transcontinental, across the ocean.
And so he drove to Atlanta, got on an airplane, flew to Canada. From there, went
to England, to Portugal.
Stayed in Lisbon, or near Lisbon, for a couple of weeks, and he was running low on money.
Back to England, and then contemplates going to Africa.
And I said, James, why did they arrest you? He said, it was just a dumb thing. He said, I flat ran out of money, and so I had to pull off a petty scam, and they caught me. But he said, if I hadn't run out of money, they'd never caught me.
One of the very serious problems with the case is, where did Ray get the money to do all these things, to escape the FBI dragnet?
His attorney told him that if he would plead guilty to the murder and end the trial, that within 2 weeks he would demand a retrial, and he had enough evidence to get him completely off.
Where did he get the funding, to go ahead and escape detection, for all these weeks going on to months?
Well, James by then is fed up with the whole deal, so he confessed. But his attorney, just as soon as the trial was over, headed back to Houston. Never showed up again.
Foreman used some very unethical means to go ahead and convince Ray to plead guilty. He essentially told him he would probably be executed. Therefore, his only choice was to go ahead and go along with him to escape the electric chair. On top of that, since the authorities in Memphis knew that Foreman was cooperating with them, they really went ahead and started brutalizing Ray inside his prison cell. They wouldn't allow many visitors. They had these very powerful lights on outside his cell, which made it very difficult for him to sleep. And this put him in a weakened state, to finally go ahead and cooperate, with Foreman.
Those that maintain James Earl Ray was framed or is innocent say that he never actually confessed to the murder of MLK. He pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty on the advice of his lawyer. Is there not a difference?
I'm sure legally there's a difference between admitting guilt and admitting and saying you did it. You say, I plead guilty versus I shot Martin Luther King. Okay. But I find that his interview with King's son to be very revealing. He didn't just say, no, I didn't do it. If you didn't do it, you just say, no, I didn't do it, end of story. There's nothing left to be said. But he gave that waffling thing about, well, some people, you can always interpret it differently, and, oh yeah? So to me, that was a guilty plea right there.
At the Lorraine Motel, the alleged murder weapon is there, but in small print it says, well, there's a dispute. There is no dispute. The only dispute is between the official story, of which there is no evidence to back.
One of the most interesting parts of the attempt by Pepper to open a new criminal case down in Memphis says in the pretrial motions, Judge Joe Brown wanted to retest the rifle and to also go ahead and get the reports on the alleged slug that supposedly killed King. One of the most interesting things he discovered is that when the FBI got the evidence, they cut up the slug into sections. This made it very, very difficult to go ahead and match the supposed projectile, to the rifle. It's simply not accepted legal practice when you get evidence like that, as important as that in a case like this. You don't go cutting it up like a pie into pieces.
I've been to the Lorraine Motel and I've seen what they call the murder weapon, but I also held a conference when I was in the Congress, and we had on the panel everyone who is intimately aware of the detailed facts of the assassination and the evidence that leads to someplace other than where the people and the lore have directed us. At the Lorraine Motel, the alleged murder weapon is there, but in small print it says, well, there's a dispute. There is no dispute. The only dispute is between the official story, of which there is no evidence to back, and the facts which constitute evidence that the official story is at best a lie.
What he did find out is that when the FBI did try and test it, they couldn't match the actual projectile to the actual rifle. So he was going to go ahead and sanction these rifle tests, to see the spin and also the markings on this new projectile would match the recorded markings that the FBI did make records of before they cut up the bullet.
If you think somebody else did it and that bullet is evidence of that, okay, where's the gun that fired that bullet?
He did manage to get off one set of rifle tests, all right? And they ended up being inconclusive because there had been a buildup of residue in the barrel of the rifle.
Conspiracy theorists have no evidence at all for their claims. All they do is pull out things like that. The way things are worded, it's possible. It's not fully conclusive. It isn't totally linked. Aha! they say, then that means my theory is true. No, it doesn't. You have to have positive evidence in favor of your theory.
Did James Earl Ray have any role in King's death, or was he merely a patsy?
Being a patsy is a role. I recently read a paper that talked about the various patterns that of FBI activity, how can I say, that would characterize how the FBI behaved toward various organizations and movement organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. And James Earl Ray was merely a patsy, but there are patterns in the behavior of the FBI in this counterintelligence program. One of the patterns is the use of what one would call patsies. Of course, you have to blame it on somebody, right?
If you think somebody else shot Ray, who did it? So you can't just say, well, they did it. The Johnson administration, who? You know, there's thousands of people in the government, hundreds of thousands of people working for the federal government. Name one.
Once King began to rail against the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson completely turned against King.
I think the main motive for King being killed is Johnson resented the fact that King was trying to bring in civil rights to the South. And also he was speaking often against the Vietnam War. And obviously the contractors didn't want the Vietnam War to end.
Some people believe that when he expanded out from this original civil rights thinking into these areas of Vietnam and the misdistribution of wealth in the United States, this is what eventually ended up being the motive for his assassination. Once King began to rail against the Vietnam War and calling America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, Lyndon Johnson completely turned against King. In fact, it got so bad they wouldn't even talk to each other.
A memo that was stamped CIA, and it was written May 11th, 1965. And that memo stated somewhere at the top, there must be a Negro who is clean, who can step into the vacuum and chaos once Dr. King is either exposed or assassinated. Elements inside the government were going to find a clean Negro who they would select and lead the people to believe that the Negro leader that they selected was actually their leader. So this was a plain old regime change.
People don't like to think that a lone assassin, a nobody, can take down a great person. We want the cause of our effects to match. That is, the size of the event should have a cause that's equally big. JFK, leader of the free world, handsome, articulate, intelligent, and powerful, was taken down by who? Lee Harvey Oswald, this lone nut, a nobody? No, 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 it's gotta have been the Mafia and the CIA and the KGB and Johnson. We want like some vast conspiracy to match in size.
Lloyd Jowers was the owner of Jim's Grill, the restaurant near the Lorraine Motel in Memphis where Dr. King was assassinated. In December 1993, Jowers appeared on ABC television and related the details of an alleged conspiracy involving the Mafia and the U.S. government to kill Dr. King. According to Jowers, James Earl Ray was the scapegoat and not involved in the assassination. Jowers believed that Memphis police officer Lieutenant Earl Clark fired the fatal shot. The United States Justice Department published the results of its extensive investigation into Jowers' allegations and concluded that his allegations were not substantiated nor credible, and that they found significant evidence to refute those claims. However, in 1998, the King family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Jowers and other unknown co-conspirators for the murder of Dr. King. During the trial, which surprisingly received virtually no media coverage, a Memphis jury found Jowers, not James Earl Ray, responsible for Dr. King's death. Further, the jury agreed that the assassination plot involved other governmental agencies. As Mark Twain said, a conspiracy is nothing but a secret agreement of a number of men for the pursuance of policies which they dare not admit in public. After examining the evidence, I believe Twain might as well have been talking about the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And now, I'd like to know what you think. You can contact me here at The Conspiracy Show through the website, www.theconspiracyshow.com. In the meantime, don't be afraid.